Hey everyone, this is Jake Wynn, and this is Public History with Justin, Jake, and Molly. Before we get started with this episode, if you're enjoying the show, make sure you are subscribed wherever you're listening. And if you have a moment, leave us a rating and a review. That helps more people find the podcast. Today, we're joined by Fin Dwyer, historian and creator of the Irish History podcast. For more than a decade and a half, Fin has been producing one of the most consistent and wide-ranging public history podcasts out there, covering everything from medieval Ireland to the Great Famine and the modern era in Irish history. His work reaches a global audience and has become a major entry point for people looking to better understand the story of Ireland and its people. I count myself among those listeners. In this conversation, we talk about how he got started in podcasting, how the medium has evolved since 2010, and what it takes to sustain that kind of work over the long term. We also dig into something that sits at the center of both of our work: how we communicate complex history to a public audience. That includes questions of nuance, interpretation, and what happens when historical debates move into public spaces, especially online. So this is a conversation about Irish history, but it's also about the practice of public history more broadly. So let's get into it. Here's my interview with Fin Dwyer. All right, everybody. We are here with Fin Dwyer, who is the voice behind the Irish History podcast, and someone I have had the opportunity to work with a little bit on one of his other projects, the Transatlantic podcast that he does with my friend Damian Shields as well. Fin, how are you doing this morning?
I'm good, Jake. Thanks very much for the invite to come on. I'm looking forward to having a good conversation.
Yeah, I'm very excited to kind of dig into a little bit of your story as well. I always love some good backstory on some of the folks doing incredible history work, and I have to say I am a huge fan of your work, of the Irish History podcast. I think for those of you listeners out there that haven't listened to it yet, definitely check it out. There is a lot of great content there if you are interested in Irish history and just about every facet of Irish history. I think you've covered it from just about every angle, Fin.
Well, don't say that. I'm always afraid I'll do myself out of a job. I'll come to the conclusion there's not anything left to say, but I suppose that's there's a lot to cover.
Yeah, that's I think you show just the level of how come when you get into this, there are so many different layers that you can explore and so many different angles, that so many ways that stories that you may be very, very familiar with, there's always new perspectives. And I think we were just talking about before we jumped on the air, kind of a new series that you are working on with the Irish History podcast, Brothers in Pain, kind of about the Irish War of Independence. Could you talk just a little bit about that series and kind of the perspective that that's bringing to a story that's very, very well known?
Yeah, so actually it's a bit of a new departure for the show. So there's a guest host. I introduced the episodes and kind of record an ending, but the actual episodes are recorded by Dr. Brian Hanley from Trinity College Dublin. He'd be kind of a leading authority on the Irish Republican movement in the 20th century. But the series of 10 podcasts looks at the international connections of the IRA in the Irish War of Independence. So obviously we always focus on, Irish rebels and maybe, a stereotypical Irish countryside. But the Irish Revolution took place in a global crisis, a time of revolution. The First World War is coming to an end. The Russian Revolution has happened. The US is going through what would become known later, I suppose, as the First Red Scare. And continental Europe is in the grip of revolution. So these play a hugely important part in the Irish story. And actually the title kind of gets the essence of it. So the title Brothers in Pain is actually from a Republican journal during the Irish War of Independence, where the journalist is asking the question, if Irish Republicans attempt to get support in the USA fails, they'll have to turn to what they call their brothers in pain, and that's Indian and Egyptian nationalists who are seeking independence from the British Empire at the same time. And I think we never think of that in terms of the Irish War of Independence, that it's happening as the British Empire is at its height, but is clearly on the way down. So Irish people have a huge amount in common with Indian nationalists and Egyptian nationalists, and all of those. They're all looking at each other because they're the big three at the time. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's a global history of the Irish Revolution. That's a bit of a long answer. Sorry.
No, that's great. I've been enjoying listening to the beginnings of it and looking forward to exploring it more. And I've explored a lot of the series that you've done on different topics.
Mhm.
A particular favorite of mine, although it's I'm a fan of a little bit, admittedly, of the darker stories and really helping to understand. My connection to Irish history and how I got into it is really through and kind of the episode that we did with Transatlantic about Pennsylvania's anthracite coal
Mhm.
region where I grew up, and understanding the history there, especially in the mid 19th century, is you have to understand the Irish story as
Mhm.
well, because
Mhm.
so many of the immigrant communities that arrive in Pennsylvania in the mid 19th century are coming there as a result of the famine in the 1840s and 1850s. So I really enjoyed that series that you did on the famine as well. Many part series that really helped to contextualize for me that experience of what it was like, and then also the immigrant story and how
Mhm.
that evolved over the course of that those disastrous years. So kudos to you for your storytelling
Thank
as
you.
well. It really is. It makes history very very approachable. And I love the podcasting format, and I want to dig into that a little bit here. But it's kind of like the bite-sized, kind of like serialized stories from newspapers back in earlier time periods, where it's kind of these bite-sized chunks of this bigger story that you kind of get week over week over week.
Yeah, I think that's a real advantage of podcasting because, you can look at a story from, whenever, the 1840s, 1850s, and there may not be a book in it. Oftentimes we've got glimpses of people's lives. They might appear in workhouse records or emigration records or whatever it is, but we've got a fragment of their life and we can build out a picture of their life over 6 months, a year, something like that. But it's never going to become a book. But a podcast allows you to get that story out there and, delve into broader histories around it. And I think there's lots of issues around podcasting, and I think we're still coming to terms about how how reliable the
Mhm.
information you get in the podcast is. But I think it's great for that, and publishing houses were always that gateway or like gatekeeper rather, and
Mhm.
they had their bottom lines that they had to work to, but and people curse it sometimes that podcast microphones are too cheap, but it does allow you to you come across an interesting story and you're going, oh, well, maybe I can get an hour and a half out of that, or a half an hour,
Mhm.
or 10 minutes. And you can share those histories that otherwise are just going to be lost. Like they're not lost, but, they're in archives and they're never going to become a book. But they're, I really like that aspect of podcasting, particularly when it relates to history.
Absolutely. And I felt very similarly, kind of writing and blogging a little
Mm,
bit. Just it is very much so, like there are stories there that it's something that you can pull out. It's going to be 300 words, but it's at least it's probably the only time anyone's ever going to share that story, because it just doesn't always they don't always fit into other projects, like you said, like a larger project. So it's like a great way of of getting that story out there and getting people to engage with it. And
mm,
I've been feeling very similarly as a relatively new podcaster and somebody that's struggling to to keep it up. I think that it's amazing that you've done it for a decade and a half of like consistently
mm.
putting out the product, because it's been a journey to get there myself. But how did you get into this in the first place? I think going back to, was it 2010 that you just kind of
Yeah.
started things up, a different era in podcasting. How did you come to starting the Irish History podcast?
Yeah. So I didn't realize it at the time, but podcasting then was going through, I suppose, its second big wave at the time after smartphones kind of become commonplace around 2008. A lot more people can engage in podcasting. It kind of had an earlier history where it almost made it and then died away.
Mhm.
But it was around that time that I got or started listening to podcasts. I think it was my brother who might have put me on. Maybe it was John Carlin's Hardcore History. Then I got into, I suppose, the podcast that most influenced me starting was Mike Duncan's. history of Rome. Probably have more in common in terms of outlook with Mike Duncan. So I found that easier but I found it a really great format. Like I had done a degree in Greek and Roman history, essentially. So I had an understanding. So it was really nice to go back to it. And again, coming back to that idea, he breaks down Roman history into these like digestible chunks, might be a good way to put it, because obviously the history of the Roman Empire can be this like, and the Republic before it, almost impossible to get your head around. And just around that time, I just got diagnosed with what turned out to be Crohn's disease, and it's a very unusual form of it. And I was very sick for about 5 or 6 years. I had a series of huge operations, and I couldn't work. I was reading. I'd always been interested in history. I'd done a degree in archaeology, and I was reading history, and you're kind of reading it to what end, and like obviously just the information in itself. I just decided that I'd make an Irish history podcast. I didn't really think too much. I could be desperate for overthinking things, and thankfully I didn't overthink this. And I was reading kind of early medieval Irish history, and there's a good story in some of that. Different than people imagine, but there's a good story in it. And I was like, oh, it would lend itself to a similar format. And I just started making episodes on like 8th, 9th, 10th century Irish history, the Vikings, things like that. And to be honest, even though most of what I make now is modern history, my real love is for maybe later medieval history. And so, but I had a lot of time, people, I'm not like into the idea that, you just like, everyone could do it if they can. Like I was very lucky at the time. Being ill had a side effect in that I had a lot of free time. I came in at a time where there was very few podcasts. I don't think there was any podcast on Irish history at all. Very few Irish podcasts. Maybe there might have been a handful of podcasts being made in Ireland at the time. So like you're coming into a much, much smaller market or audience, but like there's so little out there. So I was able to get a big enough audience. And actually the US was quite ahead of Ireland at this time in terms of people listening to podcasts, and there was nothing in terms of Irish history, but there was a big interest in it. So the show actually grew considerably in the US, and like I'd have a audience share, like in terms of Ireland and the US, it'd be fairly similar. And it grew slowly. Like I have no interest in audio. As odd as that might sound, like audio just doesn't interest me. It's a way, it's like, I suppose, does that someone who writes a book have an interest in like the paper industry? Probably not. So that'd be the way I'd kind of my relationship. So I always struggled with that. I'm really lucky now to have like a sound engineer, Kate, who works with me. So she has to handle all the problems I create on that end. But I really enjoyed just like being able to read, research, but with a purpose, as in like, it wasn't a job at the time. As I say, I wasn't working. And then around 2015, 16, podcasting was really starting to like get a wind behind it. And my health had recovered, and I kind of had this decision going, am I going to just tap away? But once I'm back working full time, it's hard. You come home in the evening, you don't necessarily want to jump on a microphone or read a book about like, where you have to read the book. It's different to read a book for pleasure and read a book when you have to analyze it. And I just decided, look, I'm going to try and see if I can make this thing work. And I was very lucky that it did. It was around that time that Patreon was kind of gaining a respectability is an odd word, but like that people could trust that platform, because obviously everyone is cautious about putting in details online. And if you go, here, give me your credit card details, people are going to be like, no, I'm not going to do that. But Patreon had the name recognition that people would trust it. And that was like the first step to making it a viable career. And then later on, advertising came part of that as well. But I've been very lucky with an audience who supported my work, and like the show just would not happen without that. And, because sometimes episodes I've been working on a series on the Magdalen laundries in Ireland now for a year. And I'm really lucky that I've got a very patient audience who are willing to support my work. So, like a couple of different things there, I suppose.
It's incredible just to see, I'm fascinated by that kind of progression of how podcasting kind of evolved, and how it can become a career. And I know you kind of studied it in school. Did you have an interest in kind of a career in history? Is that what you were pursuing before, or?
Yes and no. So I did a degree in archaeology and something called Greek and Roman civilization, like a lot like Greek history, Roman history, and kind of a bit of archaeology as well. I did a master's then in archaeology after that. Then I went working in archaeology. But in 2008, the Irish economy, like the global economy, fell off a cliff, and archaeology was one of the worst affected industries. Like I've seen statistics that said like 85% of Irish archaeologists were unemployed by the end of the first year of the recession. And, that kind of rings true to other people I know. I will say probably if I look back, at that time I was starting to get sick as well. So I don't think I could have worked anyway in archaeology in the long term. I don't think I was a very good archaeologist. I was interested in it, but I'm not sure I was a very good one. I liked reading archaeological reports, maybe not creating them. I think I would have liked the idea of working in history, but maybe had no idea what that would look like. I don't know, would you become a tour guide, or I wouldn't have gone, oh, that's what I want to do. Yeah, I want to work in tourism, or I want to get into research. The idea of working somehow in the historical space, yes, that did appeal to me, but I didn't have any idea about how that would work. And I kind of fell into podcasting, and then podcasting kind of fell into a career.
It's funny. It's kind of a recurring theme as we've talked to a variety of different people that work in and adjacent to history, whether they be in museums. Kind of my background is in museums, and parks and battlefield sites, and all the different ways that we can approach history and how history is communicated. And it's just so many journeys to and so many different pathways to get to sharing the passion we all share in translating those, what we love to read. We're reading for pleasure, we're reading history, we're taking in these stories, and then you get to a point where it's kind of like, I need an outlet for this. I need to share the gospel of this, all of this historical knowledge that I have acquired.
Yeah, definitely. I need to stop boring the ears off the people I'm going to the pub with.
Yeah, you found your people. You found your people online. You're like, here it is. Here it is. You all enjoy this. Take it. Do with it what you will.
Yeah, like that has been, like, you can see it in all walks of life, but that is a great part of online communities, is that they're not limited to the physical world, which I'm old enough to remember that time, and it had its advantages, it had its benefits, but it did have its drawbacks,
So in this, very large back catalog, which I'm still working my way through diligently, as a recent convert to all things Irish history, admittedly, before like 3-4 years ago, I knew next to nothing about Irish history. You've given me a good place to start and work my way through. So I'm very appreciative of that, Finn. Through that back catalog, of all of these episodes and different topics that you've done, are there any episodes, topics, or series that you think of as kind of, your favorite, or the ones that have been most impactful maybe on your audience?
Yeah, I think they're actually two different things. Sorry, just in terms of, like, I think my audience would prefer my real interest, or no, I'm interested in all of history. That makes it sound like I have no interest in modern history. I do, but my, if I could spend all my time, I'm intrigued by the late Middle Ages, and particularly something called the crisis of the 14th century. So that's a time when the Black Death arrives in Europe, but it's also a time of huge change in Ireland. There's an invasion from Scotland. The worst famine in Irish history, of all of our Irish history, takes place in this century as well. And those moments really intrigue me. Just, how do human beings endure through these crises? And I would have spent an awful lot of my time, years, researching this. I wrote a book on the Black Death as well in Ireland, and how it affected Ireland. So that's my favorite part of history. I do, in terms of what I think is the most important part of Irish history, which is, I suppose, separate, and something that I spent a lot of time going back to, is the Great Hunger of the 1840s. I think you can't understand modern Irish history without understanding the Great Hunger. Whether you know anything about medieval Ireland, doesn't matter. That's a world that's on the verge of almost fantasy. It's so far back. But the Great Hunger is more important than the Irish War of Independence. It's more important than any rebellion in Irish history, because all the rebellions that happen after it kind of happen in the post-famine world. If I had to draw an analogy, it would be like the Second World War's impact on the later 20th century. You can't understand any part of global history without understanding the impact of the Second World War. So, like, if you live in China, you need to be able to understand the impact of the Sino-Japanese aspect of the Second World War to understand life there, and the same in Europe and the US. And the Great Hunger is that event in Ireland. It's the glib phrase of 1 million dead and 1 million fled, with the reference, to this catastrophic population fall. So, in terms of my listeners, I think I did a series on the Great Hunger, and that for a lot of people, so people in the US, obviously, it could be their foundation story. As in, that's when their families left Ireland, or maybe the part of their families that they identify with most left Ireland and came to the US. So that's a foundation story. In Ireland, it's seen completely differently. It's not I often think that in the US, the famine is almost, it's not a positive thing, but it is, there's something positive comes out of it. People crossed the Atlantic, began new lives that were just in pretty much every quantifiable way better than the lives they'd lived in Ireland. For Irish people living in Ireland, the famine is a completely negative experience. Ireland comes out of the famine afterwards an absolutely devastated country. Huge aspects of things that are never talked about. For example, like a mental health crisis that devastates Irish society in the late 19th century. I'm getting into the history here. I need to pull back. So I think that, and I spent a lot of time, it's something I return to constantly on the show, is the impact of the Great Hunger on Irish society. In terms of an episode within that I think a lot of listeners had opinions on, I think might be a good way, is I asked the question if the Great Famine was a genocide. I have what some people think might be a controversial opinion on that. It's not remotely controversial in the world of Irish history. I kind of feel like I should almost tease people by not saying what my opinion is, but I won't do that. Go and listen to the show. No, but
listen to the show.
I don't think that the Great Hunger was a genocide. Now, people always go, "Oh, why are you supporting the British?" That's not what I'm trying to argue. To stand accused of essentially exacerbating, overseeing a famine, in my mind, is that's not getting off lightly. But I feel we have to understand the processes at work. And if you want to analyze Ireland in the 1840s as a genocide, you're going to miss out loads of history, because it just doesn't fit into that interpretation. If you look at it in the modern understanding of a famine, then yes, you can bring in all the complexities of the Great Hunger into that. And unfortunately, I do think we live in a society partly impacted by the internet, where there's this like drive at competition between histories, and like, who's got the worst history? It's like, that's not a useful way to look at the past at all, in my mind. And when I say I don't think the Great Hunger was a genocide, that's not to say, oh, our ancestors got off lightly. That's not the history of the 1840s. The question is, how do we understand it best? And if you start with a question, which increasingly people online are encouraged to do, is going, oh, the Great Hunger was a genocide, you miss so much of the history. And I think that's kind of a disservice to our ancestors, because it's a very, very complicated story. And it's not like, it can't just be answered in 1 line, 2 lines. It's like hundreds, thousands of different Irish stories come together to create, that history. And oftentimes people just want to or put it in a box that's useful online in the 21st century to berate other people with, or to kind of have a sense of pride that our ancestors overcame this. Like, overcoming a famine is a remarkable thing. And like, the reality is over 10% of the Irish population didn't survive that. So I think, again, I've gotten totally distracted now. You see, if you get me onto the famine, I'm going to. But that's I think the episode that listeners enjoy, and I tried to make the case in it why I think it's not, and why certain things, if you break it down, the history, it doesn't. That thing of, is it a genocide? isn't a useful question to ask. And I think a lot of listeners found that interesting. Some people were, I think, because of the nature of podcasting, some people were disappointed that I said that. And, that's okay. Everyone, can have their interpretation. Just because I say it, that's what I think. It doesn't mean I'm like, there's people who say it is. It's an episode I enjoyed making because like, I had to go back and really get my argument clear. That kind of sounds like I don't normally do that, but the you have to get that argument clear as to why. And I tried to make the case that I think the British government stand accused of something absolutely abhorrent, because they were responsible for what happened in Ireland in the 1840s. There's no question in my mind about that. It's just what they did.
Yeah.
I feel I'm very defensive, and I think it's very hard not to be defensive about this argument. And I think that's kind of part of podcasting because it's very much front-facing, audience-facing, and I feel like I have to go, but I'm not a British apologist.
Yeah.
And, it's kind of, because that episode has been clipped up and misquoted all over the place. And I'm quite conscious of that. But I think that was something that a lot of listeners found useful, enjoyed. And because of the nature of podcasting, some people were maybe disappointed that I came to that conclusion. It's not, I will say, sorry, this is the defensive part of me coming back in. It's not remotely controversial in the world of Irish history that you won't find an Irish historian that makes the case it was a genocide. Some journalists will, but not historians. I think I've totally driven the conversation off in a very different direction, but sorry, Jake.
No, that's a direction that it's weird to say enjoy for that subject matter, but this is a conversation that I think is really important. It's actually one that we touch on quite frequently. You kind of hit on it there with, I find it's sometimes challenging when being very public facing and being very out there, that the public, I feel like I'm being defensive now. There's a lack of nuance and a lack of desire to understand that there are nuances, that there's always a search for quick answers, what satisfies kind of a very emotionally driven kind of perspective on history, where it's, as you said, kind of 1 and 2 sentences. It was a genocide, and then you're out. And I've seen the downstream impacts of this very argument as I have started to endeavor to tell kind of more of the immigration story of northeastern Pennsylvania, which of course includes the Irish immigration of the 19th century, but also includes Polish, Eastern European, Italian immigration into the region as well. And what I find just kind of disappointing, oftentimes the comment sections. I know I shouldn't read the comments, but they go off the rails because people have these, they wrap up these kind of emotionally charged perspectives that aren't necessarily historically based at all, and they use that as a, to bludgeon each other online. And it's, I find it very frustrating, and I try to at all occasions to just take a step back and be like, there are more perspectives. This isn't like there is one answer. History is not, there is not the truth. There are many perspectives and interpretations, as you said, and also just sometimes informing the public that, and talking to an audience is like, here it's kind of introducing them to this higher level of thinking about this. And as you said, no Irish historians are saying that this is a genocide. It's like, you can be that conduit to introduce that fact. Say, this is not just my perspective. This is also the perspective of this historical community, and this is why. And that's where you serve as, and I kind of public historians in general, when I'm talking about this, it's like we serve as that kind of connecting point to the historians, to the academics, to the people who have made it their life's work to really study this nuance in depth, and kind of be sort of like a translator for that, if that's kind of how I describe it.
Yeah, like there's one thing I come back on there, Jake, is I do think actually the public has been poorly enough served by the the academic historical community in the
Mm-hmm.
later 20th century. I can't remember who it was. It was either E.P. Thompson or Eric Hobsbawm. There were two very famous kind of public historians who were both academics but did a lot of public history in
Mm-hmm.
Britain. E.P. Thompson wrote one of the most famous books in history called The Making of the English Working Class. But it was one of them anyway that talked about the idea when they were in university around maybe before even the Second World War or around that time, talking about how you could read PhD theses and they were accessible. And that as the 20th century progressed, if you pick up a PhD thesis now and you haven't been to a third level institution and probably gone on to
Mm-hmm.
research level, you will struggle to read those. And he was kind of bemoaning the fact that history was becoming less and less accessible. And I
Mm-hmm.
think there is a tendency in that, this is like, it's a very complicated question, but like things like academic journals, academic books
Mm-hmm.
are so expensive. Like if you buy a book that's
Yeah.
been published by an academic press, it's going to cost 130 euros or dollars, or, it's just not going to be affordable and often readable by the general public. And that doesn't have to be the case. Now, people who say, well, they're trying to make complex arguments, but in my opinion, it's on the historian to make the complex argument in a way that someone, with a reasonable understanding, someone who can read a book like of a couple of hundred pages, if you could do that, like it's on the historian to try and make the argument in the same way. And I think there's a tendency in third level institutions to encourage people to use like complex language.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not like, this kind of almost makes me sound like anti-academic. Like I rely on academic research for a
Yep.
lot of the podcasts I make. So I'm like a huge fan of it. It just, your point about like having, it's almost sometimes you feel like a translator.
Yeah.
And there's, I think that is, I think, for example, if we go back to the history of the Great Hunger, like the famine was not, there's an idea the famine was not discussed in Irish society at all. Now, I don't think that's the case. There's no question, though, that Irish historians did not address the famine, particularly after the outbreak of the Troubles in the North, because they were afraid of writing histories, as one historian would later admit, that would be sympathetic to the IRA. Whatever, like that's like, why, it's not the job of the historian to like write histories that are for or against something. You're studying the past, and if that benefits a Republican analysis of Irish history, well, there's probably something to think about in that. So essentially, Irish historians pulled off the field and didn't get involved in trying to explain the most important event in our history to the public. And other people did step in. And the arguments around it being a genocide, I think, took root in that lack of understanding of this pivotal event. So while I think, and I think the internet has been really negative in many respects, because it really, simplistic one-liners, as you say, but I do think historians did kind of pull away in certain areas and often retreat into uncontroversial topics. Like, and I think that's becoming more and more the case today. People don't want to comment on, be it Palestine, be it, like there's a series of issues that people don't want to talk about. And I think that's across academia in general, just this retreat into safety.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's something that we see, and I talked about a little bit about this previous episode with Damian Shields, talking about the American Civil War and topics around the Confederacy, and talking about, what is going on in the Confederacy, talking about slavery. And there are aspects of that, especially when it comes to things like the Confederate Army and understanding Confederate leadership, that there has been over the last decade and a half, a pullback from support for those kinds of efforts, those kinds of projects, because of events that have been taking place. And now we're seeing kind of that being turned over and flipped over, where it's, topics that, whether it's talking about, women's history, talking about the history of slavery, where that has become now kind of being punished by organizations associated with the federal government, or people who are granting out money because they fear retribution from the federal government. So it touches on, the perspectives of history, the work that is being done. We're going out there to tell the story of the past and what happened as accurately as possible. And that is always going to be shaped by what's going on in our world right now. And I think, obviously it's like no answers for this in this part of the 21st century where it's like
Yeah.
everything feels very, very unsettled. Um, whether it be in general society or when it comes to the study and sharing of history.
Yeah, yeah, and I think I don't know where this came from, but there's a view that the historian is like kind of almost neutral in all this, and the historians
Mm,
don't have opinions and don't have opinions that shape them. But that's just not true. Like obviously,
yeah.
like we are biased. Like biased, obviously, kind of maybe conjures up the idea that someone is intentionally misleading people. That's not what I'm talking about. Is that like you've got your understanding of the world, and that will influence how you think about the world, but
Hmm.
then obviously influence how you think about the past. Now, a good historian is able to go, well, this I find this unsettling because it contradicts how I generally see the world, but that doesn't
Hmm.
matter. That has to go in. That's part of the
Yeah.
story. Um, but I think people like the idea that somehow there's a true historian out there who's a just tells the truth, and that all these other people who say things I disagree with, but they're liars, or they're biased, and that's something that I think we have to come to terms with, and I
Hmm.
kind of accept. Look, it's okay to have these differences of opinion. Now
Hmm.
it's hard in the world we live in today, where there's absolutely horrific things going on around us, and history is embedded in this. Like a lot of this stuff is happening out of history. Like talking about, I suppose you look at Iran, Palestine, things like that. You can
Hmm.
trace those things back to relatively recent history, but history is important in those. Um, and trying to have conversations is useful, like, and it'll deepen people's understanding. And I think otherwise you get this really perplexing, like, if you don't understand Irish history, it can be very perplexing to people as to why Irish people tend, on the whole, to be quite sympathetic to the Palestinians.
Yeah.
Now, there's reasons for it's actually it's not necessarily as simplistic as people think, but it is shaped by our general kind of understanding of that conflict is shaped by our own history. Now, there's a lot of kind of history isn't a straight line back to the past, but there is a general sense that we went through something like this, and
Yeah.
therefore that's how we understand it. And I look, there's lots of other interpretations of it, but if you don't, my point is more, if you don't understand the past, you'd be like, why are Irish people like that? But it's
Yeah.
because of our history, and I think that's sorry, I'm just trying to connect up the past and the present in that.
This the interconnectedness of our shared histories is such an important piece. It's like you can't understand what's going on right now. Let's say take Iran for example
Mm,
and conflict going on there without understanding what happened 50 years ago and then
yeah,
what happened
yeah,
80 years ago
yeah,
and the history, the intertwined histories of the United States and Iran, that
mm,
is a very sordid tale, and
yeah,
one that is full of full of both sides of playing a part in getting us to the current conflict and understanding how that impacted the whole world, whether
yeah,
it's
yeah,
1970s fuel crises or
yeah,
impact on American elections related to the 1979 and 1980 Iranian
yeah,
hostage situation. And I'm always banging this drum as well, Finn. Like, you need to historians do need to be aware of the need to make that connection. We are not doing our jobs if we are not
mm,
informing the public about what is going on in the world now through the lens of what has happened before to help provide understanding
mm.
of how we got to the present moment. I think it's really, really important. If we're not doing that, we're doing a disservice to our audiences, because it's necessary to make those connections so people think historically. I'm a very strong proponent of thinking historically and being able to bring that context into decisions that, say, leaders are making right now.
Yeah, and I think it's for people listening to it. I think it is important to remember that, like, that thing of like historians are not like the way you think about current affairs. You have your own opinions and they shape it. Historians, in many ways, are the same, looking at the past in a general sense.
Mhm.
Obviously, we have the privilege of getting into like records, and that can present challenging things. You go, God, I didn't think that's the way,
Mhm.
whatever, the world in general works, but like
Yeah.
all the evidence is contradicting that, and that, you have to think about that. And but the idea that you're not shaped by, and maybe really simple things that, a left-wing person will look more at class, conservative people might look at other factors, but that
Mhm.
shapes the history that they're writing. It doesn't mean that either one is biased. It just shapes what they see as like the most important driver in society. Because look, if we put down everything that happened in the past, it would be a very boring, long story that would be completely inaccessible. We have to prioritize, stack things, and ultimately identify what we think is the driver behind something. And, histories of the French Revolution or the Irish Revolution, for example, will do that.
Mhm.
They'll go, what was the key issue that like pushed French society over the edge in 1789 or Irish society over the edge in 1919? And then the historian's bias will probably come into play into
Yeah.
terms of how they understand the world. And I think bias might sit uncomfortably with people. And what I just mean by that is like, none of us are a blank slate. We have
Right.
been shaped by things, and we generally bring that, for want of a better term, baggage into the room. But I don't think it's baggage. I don't think it's bad. I think it's important to acknowledge that, like,
Mhm.
a historian is not an oracle of truth.
Yeah.
No.
It makes the study of history fun in that there are all these perspectives. So it's like you say somebody that is coming from a more left-wing perspective, a historian, versus somebody that's more conservative, and read their writings about the same events and the different
Yeah.
lens they see those events through, and balance them against each other and see, like, look at them and how they interpret those same events differently. It's just like if, you and I, Finn, we're experience or witness the same events, our perspectives of those same events are going to be different. They're going to be
Yeah.
different things that we
Yeah, of course.
notice. They're
Yeah.
going to be different things
Yeah.
that we feel about those events. And it's the same way with history. And that's what I think makes it interesting. It's like all of those perspectives and all these different pieces, these different threads that we pull together to weave in and tell a story. There's so many different ways. There's a million different ways that you could do it. And ultimately it is, like you said, your bias, your perspectives that are going to shape how you tell that story. Whether it's, me doing the public history podcast, you doing the Irish history podcast, we could be told to give a prompt to tell the same story, and we're going to both do it
Yeah.
very differently.
There's probably something very interesting. You could do a great experiment on that. I do think actually it's probably just that we're talking about podcasts. So I think it's a drawback, maybe, or not. A drawback is the wrong way of phrasing it, but like, we kind of talked a little bit about this off air, but like podcasting is an unusual format in that the listener will often develop, a parasocial relationship with the
Mm-hmm.
host where they feel that the host is a friend. And I think then if the historian in that way says something that you might not agree with, you feel maybe a level of personal betrayal. I'm guessing, I'm just thinking of shows I listen to, and like, the person
Yeah.
says something that, I just, it's not the way I look at the world, or I don't agree or like that opinion. And I'm like, oh, it's like,
Yeah.
it's not like if I'm reading a book and I'm like, because a book is fairly impersonal. You don't really have a personal association with the history book or the person behind the history book. But obviously, because the human voice is so powerful,
Mm-hmm.
it can really drive that home. And I think that is a challenge about podcasting, isn't it? Like, because
Yeah.
it's great that you can have that kind of personal connection with people, but then does that, it brings its own baggage.
Well, Finn, as we're kind of drawing to a close here, just curious, what are you working on in the future? What are you reading, listening to, enjoying in these bleak times of ours?
Yeah, history doesn't seem as bleak as it used to. Well, I'm working on something actually that is very bleak. It's the history of the Magdalen laundries in Ireland. These were institutions where women were incarcerated through the 20th. Well, their history goes back centuries, but yeah, just where people could be institutionalized for standing against what was considered to be the norms of the day. They were forced to work without wages, and often had their lives stolen from them. So I'm trying to present that history in a, we can be overwhelmed by negativity. And, there's no point in saying that this is a dark story. It's not like, I'm not going to say, oh, it was actually all fine. It wasn't.
Yeah.
But it is important to try and make it in a way that that people will listen to it and not be like, I can't handle that.
Mhm.
What am I reading? I am reading crime fiction.
Oh.
I can't remember the title of the book. It's set in Japan. It's quite good, actually. And what am I listening to? I am listening to a novel set during the Black Death, but it's kind of like a time traveling thing. Pretty good.
Okay.
I
Nice.
should have come up with more like, oh, I'm listening to The Rest is History, and I'm like,
No. That's perfect. That's perfect. That's like it's the real. We're about the authenticity here. It's like, we want
actually,
to hear what your fiction reading, what you
I
got.
can lower the tone even further by saying we've been watching what you call that thing about the Mormons? It's a fundamentalist Mormons, Sister Wives.
Oh yeah.
A reality show set among a fundamentalist Mormon household, which, like, reality TV is what it is. It's terrible, but like when you're tired after work, you just go put this on. I'll watch this. I gain
Yep.
nothing from it. It probably takes something from me in terms of like, but yeah, that's my high and, well, just lowbrow the way I pass my time these days.
Love it. Well, Finn, this has been a great conversation. I've enjoyed chatting with you. Thank you for all the work that you do. And yeah, we really, really appreciate you joining us on the Public History Podcast.
Thanks very much for having me on, Jake. That was a great conversation.
That was Fin Dwyer, creator of the Irish History Podcast. I'm super thankful to Finn for working with me on that, recording across the Atlantic and timing everything up, and pulling that all together was a bit challenging, but we had a lot of fun in our conversation, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. And if you haven't listened yet to the Irish History Podcast or the other podcast we didn't really talk about, Transatlantic, that Finn has created with my friend Damian Shields, definitely check both of those out. You can find those links to those shows in the show notes. And if you haven't yet subscribed, rated, or reviewed this podcast, The Public History with Justin, Jake, and Molly Show, please do so now. We would really appreciate your feedback, as well as helping to boost the algorithm to get this show into more people's feeds as well. So thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.